Hello everyone! Today you will learn about programs and services for English learners in Connecticut. You're also going to learn about some basic concepts for the provision of programs for English learners in our state. Here are some of the references I use for this presentation. Please feel free to click on the links if you want to learn more about the content of the presentation. And here are some objectives for you. At the end of the presentation, you will be able to list the different programs and services offered to English learners in our state. You will also be able to identify the characteristics of the different programs. For example, you will be able to talk about the characteristics of students and teachers, and also you will be able to talk about the ultimate goals for each program, what each program intends to reach for their students educationally. You will also be able to recall the basics of the Connecticut law in regards to program offerings for English learners and also the limitations of the law for schools and students. As you can see, you will learn a lot throughout this presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Throughout the presentation, you will see comprehension checks, which are questions about the content that had just been presented. You might want to stop the presentation, think about these questions, and answer them. These questions can help you with the quiz that you will take after the end of the session. Let's begin by introducing some key terms. The first one is LEA, or Local Educational Agency. You might have heard this term somewhere else in previous classes, perhaps when we discussed the statistics about Connecticut programs and Connecticut language learners. So Connecticut has 173 LEAs, or local educational agencies. Think of an LEA as a public board of education or any other public authority legally constituted within a state to administrate elementary or secondary schools. So for example, New Haven, Hartford, Bridgeport are all LEAs because they have boards of education that administer a number of schools within them. The second term is LATI, or language other than English. We use this term to refer to the languages of students and families in a general way. So for example, we can say, in my school, many students speak languages other than English at home. And we already have covered this term in previous classes. A new term for you is that of TBE, or Transitional Bilingual Education. You're going to hear this term often in this presentation. This term refers to a type of bilingual program offered to English learners in the state of Connecticut. More details about this program will be presented later. For now, just keep these terms present in your mind as you will hear them often throughout the presentation. Let's start with reviewing the number of language learners in Connecticut schools. How many English learners do we have in Connecticut? In the state, we have 173 local educational agency, or LEAs, like we mentioned before, and which is equivalent to 206 school districts. Within these 206 districts, there are approximately 542,000 students, just to round up the number. And these are students in general, the total enrollment. From the 542,000 students, 80,000 students speak a language other than English, or LATI. Now, remember that students who speak a language other than English may or may not be identified as English learners. As we have discussed in the past, a student can be bilingual and not be identified as an English learner for services. Why is that? Well, because even though they speak a language other than English, their English might be proficient enough to participate effectively in regular education and access the regular education curriculum. So that student would not be a language learner or classified as a language learner. Of the 80,000 students who speak a language other than English, almost 35,000 have been identified as English learners. That means that in Connecticut, there are almost 35,000 students whose English proficiency is not enough to access the regular educational curriculum. Therefore, they require services that support their English language development. So as a result, we're going to study the programs and services that are offered to English learners. English learners are entitled by law for services, linguistic services or language services to access the language that in which they're going to learn, which is English. And there are different ways in which different states go about this. So for now, before we start learning about the programs available for language learners, let's just keep these questions in mind. For each program, it's important to understand the characteristics of the students in the program. So who are the students? It's also important to understand the characteristics of the teachers in the program, what language is used for instruction, and most important of all, what is the ultimate goal of the program? These questions might have very different answers from program to program, and we will discuss what are the programs that have proved the best for our language learners. So on this table, there's a lot of information, but I'm going to walk you through little by little. So the first thing that it's important to notice is that English learners in Connecticut can receive support services in programs that are English only, or English monolingual programs, or bilingual programs. We're going to start by reviewing the programs that are delivered in English only. You might be familiar with a program called English as a Second Language, or ESL. The students who receive ESL have been previously identified as English learners. That's exactly why they are in those programs. So if you have a student who is bilingual and whose English is good enough to be in regular education, they won't be in ESL. Students in ESL programs are all English learners who speak different native languages at home. The teacher in the ESL program should be certified in English as a second language. The ultimate goal of the ESL program is that students develop academic performance in English. So notice that on this table, ESL has three different ways of delivery. This first way is what we called ESL as self-contained. All students in an ESL self-contained program, all students are English learners, and they mainly learn from ESL teachers. Students in ESL self-contained programs might participate at times in regular education, but their home classroom is the ESL classroom. Very few schools, unfortunately, do a good job integrating ESL students in self-contained classrooms with the rest of the school community. So these students are often placed in classrooms that are away from all other activities, and like I said, very few schools explicitly and do a good job integrating the students. There's another type of ESL provision which is called a pull-out service, and you probably already know what this is. So this means that English learners are placed in regular education classrooms, and the ESL teacher pulls them out for English instruction. We know from research that this teaching configuration is very ineffective, and you probably are thinking right now as to why it is not the best model for students. English learners might be missing key content information when the ESL teacher pulls them out of instruction. So that's number one. And number two, in addition to interrupted instruction, unless the ESL and the regular education teacher work closely together to coordinate their instruction, the student might receive instruction during the pull-out that might not be highly relevant to the content instruction. Since Connecticut has a shortage of ESL teachers, it is very common to have pull-out services where instruction is not very in-depth or coordinated between the ESL teacher or the regular education teacher. So that is unfortunate for our students. Another way of doing ESL instruction is through pushing in the classroom, or co-teaching. So some co-teaching might occur depending on how coordinated the two teachers want to work. In this form of ESL delivery, the ESL teacher works with English learners in the regular education classroom and hopefully in a coordinated way with the regular education teacher. Both ESL and regular educators might actually teach the content together. This type of instruction delivery is more beneficial than pull-out ESL, obviously because the content is still contextualized in the classroom, and English learners receive the language support that is paired with the content that is being delivered. You can imagine that if there are gaps in their understanding, these gaps can be resolved immediately thanks to the seamless nature of this type of instruction. However, a push-in or co-teaching model can be challenging to deliver since the ESL and regular educators must work in a very coordinated way. And unfortunately, again, this is not very common. You don't see this in many schools. The other type of English monolingual instruction for language learners is that of sheltered instruction. We have discussed sheltered instruction in the past, and you might remember that in sheltered instruction, teachers deliver content, academic content, using teaching techniques that make the content comprehensible and engaging to language learners. So the 9 principles that you have been studying so far, as well as the SIOP model components, enable teachers to make content area instruction comprehensible to language learners. So in a sheltered instruction classroom, students are usually all language learners from different native languages, and the teacher is not an ESL teacher necessarily, but a content area certified teacher who knows how to work with language learners and who knows how to support them. The ultimate goal of sheltered instruction, just like ESL, is English-only academic performance. So no language other than English is used for neither ESL instruction or sheltered instruction. Regular education with integrated ELs, it's another way of providing services to language learners. In this type of setting, the student is integrated with regular education students. The language learners are integrated with regular English speakers in regular education classrooms. It is important to remember that in regular education classrooms, you might find students who used to be English learners and who have exited ESL services. The fact that they're not classified as English learners anymore, however, does not mean that the students don't need support. In fact, the students might still need support in academic English, and teachers should be able to provide that support. So in regular education with integrated language learners, a certified teacher in a content area is required, and it's a teacher that teaches regular education to students who are monolingual English speakers. So that teacher, who could be you in the future in your regular education, you might have students who have exited ESL programs, current English learners integrated with regular education students. The ultimate program goal is, again, the academic performance in English only. So as you can see, English as a second language, whether self-contained, pull-out, or push-in, sheltered instruction and regular education with integrated English learners all have the same goal, which is reaching academic performance in English only. This is why these programs constitute English monolingual education for English learners. There are other ways of providing programs to students who speak languages other than English and who are learning English in school. While the programs presented before are all delivered in English, Bilingual education programs give English learners the opportunity of learning English and also of developing literacy in the native language. In previous classes, as you might remember, we spoke about how English learners can benefit from learning content in their native language. The benefit is in that they're learning new content in a language they already understand. Therefore, we don't have to double the burden on learners. And remember, the burdens we talk about are learning new content in a language they don't still entirely comprehend. This is the tenet behind bilingual education program models in general. The added benefit for English learners in bilingual education is that they will learn English as they will also be capitalizing on their native language resources, making it more possible for students to maintain their native language and to be able to use it for academic purposes and social purposes as well. The state of Connecticut supports bilingual education in schools, at least on paper. However, the bilingual statute, which you're free to click on, which is the law that regulates bilingual education provision for English learners, is at best problematic. But before we get into the intricacies of the law, let's first review two types of bilingual programs offered in the state of Connecticut for English learners. Just to clarify, we are covering Connecticut. There are other programs that are offered in other states, but today I just want to present what's available in Connecticut so you become familiar with it. Let's begin with transitional bilingual education. This is the most prominent program in Connecticut schools for students who are English learners and who speak the same native language. In Connecticut, the languages for transitional bilingual education programs are mostly Spanish and English, since Spanish is the most spoken language other than English in the state. When an English learner has access to transitional bilingual education, the student receives content instruction in the native language while the student is exposed to English in school. By receiving content instruction in the native language, the student does not fall behind in the curriculum. This is the whole point of native language instruction. In the meantime, the student is learning English. Students can receive transitional bilingual education for 30 months, according to what Connecticut does today. After the 30 months in the program, the student will be assessed for English proficiency. If the student demonstrates that English proficiency is high enough to participate in regular education, the student will be taken out of bilingual education and will be placed in regular education. And so the support of the native language will be removed. Just a quick note before we look at the law. The duration in transitional bilingual education, with some changes that happened in the law in 2015, has been extended to 60 months. But it's not automatic. The school has to make the case for a student that requires this extension in bilingual education. So as you can see, the ultimate program goal for TBE, or Transitional Bilingual Education, is that English learners achieve academic performance in English only eventually. They use the native language for instructional purposes, but the use of the native language it's limited. And students in TBE very seldom acquire full-blown biliteracy and bilingualism. For students who have exhausted their eligibility for participation in a transitional bilingual education program, or those who haven't met the English proficiency level expected, they are provided with something that's called LTSS, or Language Transition Support Services. These are a combination of ESL services such as push-in, pull-out, as well as sheltered instruction and tutoring. It's important to remember that according to research, it might take between 5 to 7 years for an English learner to reach English academic performance or to be at the same level as their English monolingual peers. If bilingual education allows English learners to not fall behind in learning the curriculum, thanks to having access to the curriculum in the native language, 30 months, it's a very short time for an English learner to achieve English performance standards in school. So 30 months, which is 3 grade levels, compared, not even 3 full years, compared to 5 to 7 years, it's really a very short time, even if the student is learning in the native language, some of the content. In 2015, the Connecticut bilingual statute extended the 30 months to 60 months in a transitional bilingual education program for an English learner to stay in the program for an additional 30 months. But like I mentioned before, the school has to make the case of why the student needs more time in transitional bilingual education. The other way of providing bilingual education for English learners in Connecticut is referred to as dual language or dual language education. The students in this type of bilingual program are speakers of a minority language and also English-only speakers. So ideally, you will have dual language education with 50% of minority language speaking students and 50% of English speaking students in each class. Keeping these numbers balanced is very difficult, but the ideal is 50-50. The idea behind having equal numbers is that students can learn school content in both languages and that they can help each other, since in dual language, all students are language learners. For example, in most dual language schools in Connecticut, there are English language learners and Spanish language learners. The teachers who deliver instruction in the minority language in both programs, both TBE and dual language, must be certified in bilingual education. The teacher that delivers instruction in English does not have to be ESL, that's in dual language, or even in transitional bilingual education. The English teacher does not have to have ESL certification, but must be certified in a content area. The ultimate program goal for dual language is that students reach bilingualism and biliteracy in, at high levels, so high academic performance in the two languages, as well as cross-cultural understanding. When a dual language program is well designed, well staffed, and well implemented, it is actually the most effective program for both English learners and English speaking students. And the research has shown this a number of times. This table shows the programs and services provided to English learners in Connecticut between the years 2014 and 2015. Notice that the most prevalent program is transitional bilingual education. This is the program where English learners can receive instruction in their native language for 30 months as they learn English. According to this table, 24.2% of English learners, almost 8,500 students, were enrolled in TBE. We gotta also comment that the quality of transitional bilingual education varies from school to school, depending upon whether or not schools have enough funding, or whether or not schools can get bilingual teachers. The teacher shortage is really a big issue when it comes to bilingual education in Connecticut. Moving down the table, we can see that very few English learners in Connecticut have access to dual language programs. Only 4.2% of English learners are enrolled in dual language education. It's important to note that research is overwhelming in demonstrating the positive outcomes of programs that use both English and the native language of English learners. Programs that use the native language not just as a crutch, as transitional bilingual education, but as a legitimate way of imparting instruction and promoting bilingualism and biliteracy. So those are the programs that show the most benefits for English learners and also for English speakers. The research is also overwhelming in demonstrating the positive outcomes of dual language programs for English native speakers who benefit from these programs as they can become also bilingual and biliterate in a language other than English, which is always a great thing. We have very few dual language programs in Connecticut, unfortunately, and most of them are delivered in English and in Spanish, given the large population of Spanish-speaking English learners in the state. One of the biggest challenges of dual language education and of bilingual education in general, as I mentioned before, is the shortage of teachers who can teach in the non-English language. So moving down the table, please notice the large number of English learners who receive pull-out services. This number is actually the largest among it, with almost 27% of English learners receiving these services in this fashion. We mentioned before the significant disadvantages of this program for English learners, but unfortunately, it is the service that most ELs in Connecticut receive. A small number of English learners receive English services or English language services in a push-in or co-teaching model, and only 8.7% of English learners actually receive instruction in this way. And a very small number of language learners receive ESL instruction in a sheltered instruction environment. Now, it's interesting to see the percentage of English learners who don't receive ESL services due to their parents' refusal for services. Parents, as much as teachers and students, need to understand why it is important for English learners to receive language services as they're learning English in school. But many parents can see that when their child is classified as an English learner, that can carry a stigma, which is similar to the stigma of other labels that children receive in schools. I know of many parents of language learners who refuse English language services for their children, perhaps because they may wrongly think that their children will easily acquire English when they're immersed in English in the classroom. So it is important that we also educate the parents about this. Parents of ELs need to understand the challenge that represents for their children to learn both content and language at the same time. This is something that most parents don't think about, and actually most teachers sometimes don't think about. It's possibly that from the parents' perspective as adults with full-fledged native languages and identities, they might think that any immersion context with no support might be the best environment for their children to learn English and succeeding in school. But we now know, after what we have been discussing in this course, that there's nothing furthest from the truth. English learners need a lot of support, and an immersion environment with teachers who don't know how to work with language learners it's definitely not the right environment for them. Now, let's move on to the topic of the law in Connecticut and English learners. So, at the federal level, English learners are protected by a number of laws. So, they're protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and they're also protected by this right here, Lau versus Nichols in 1974, which is the only Supreme Court decision in the history of the country that protects students who are English learners. This Supreme Court decision is, like I said, titled Lau versus Nichols, and it was signed in 1974. These federal protections acknowledge that public education that is incomprehensible to students due to a language barrier are utterly ineffective. And although language supports for students are mandated, the law does not mandate or suggest specific ways of providing the services to students. The current law for elementary and secondary education, which is titled ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, and also its previous versions like No Child Left Behind in 2001, also acknowledge the responsibility of the school system to support students with language services so that they can succeed in school. So all in all, English learners are protected by the federal law and are entitled to receive English services so that they can succeed academically in school. At the state level, Connecticut has a bilingual statute. This statute states the right of English learners to an education that fulfills their needs. The statute says that English learners are entitled to receive English language services from teachers of English to speakers of other languages, or TESOL, bilingual, and these are the teachers that we call ESL teachers. They have this certification, TESOL certification. Bilingual certified teachers or other personnel who have received training in English language acquisition. As we mentioned before, the state of Connecticut, and in fact, many states in the United States, have a big shortage of teachers for English learners, which includes ESL teachers or TESOL teachers and bilingual teachers. So in this case, the educational mandate can always be appropriately fulfilled due to the low number of professionals trained to provide the services. So that already is one way in which the law doesn't always reflect the reality. Here's a short excerpt from the Connecticut State Board of Education position statement on the education of students who are English learners. This guiding document clearly states that, quote, access to quality bilingual education in English as a second language, or ESL programs, are crucial for ELs to succeed academically. This language clearly recognizes the importance of support for English learners so that they can do well in school. So I am bringing these excerpts to your attention because it's important for us to understand that the law, at least on paper, in Connecticut supports language learners and supports bilingual education. Now, in practice, this might not always be the case. So the law, unfortunately, itself poses great limitations to the provision of appropriate and quality services for English learners. Let's talk about one big problem that the state of Connecticut faces right now. The problem concerns bilingual education, and in particular, transitional bilingual education, or TBE. On this slide, you can see the excerpt from the Connecticut Bilingual Statute that dictates how transitional bilingual education programs are to be offered in school. Let's remember that transitional bilingual education programs are programs where English learners who speak the same native language receive instruction in both their native language and English for a duration of 30 months. The Connecticut law determines that when a public school houses 20 or more students who speak the same native language, a transitional bilingual education program should be made available to them. That's what it says right here. This means that in a given school that has at least 20 English learners who speak the same native language, the school is mandated to put together a bilingual program for the students the following year, and the state is supposed to provide funding. So that's great, except that there's some problems with this scenario. So what's problematic about the mandate? Many things are problematic. First, the number 20. In Connecticut, for English learners to receive transitional bilingual education and therefore be able to learn in their native language while they learn English so that they don't fall behind, the school must have 20 students who speak the same language. Not 10, not 19, but 20. In principle, this number limit is arbitrary and leaves many learners, many English learners, without the possibility of accessing a transitional bilingual education program, which in many cases is the best program for them, especially for kids who just come in the country with not much English. And that leaves them from benefiting from the option of using their native language for education. So the number 20 is problematic. Second, what happens with language learners during the year when the program is being established? Because English learners are entitled to receive services, it is likely that the only options they might have left are just ESL. And as we have mentioned before, students can learn English in ESL, of course. However, programs that use the student's native language for content instruction as the student learns English, are always going to be way superior than English-only programs. So what happens if the state funds a transitional bilingual education program? What happens if the population of students changes throughout that year where the school is supposed to put the program together? So we know that student populations change in school, and a school in after the year where they're supposed to put together their bilingual program might not have the 20 students any longer. So what happens to that? Usually, the funding gets pulled, and it's a mess. Another issue, as we have mentioned before, is the shortage of bilingual and ESL teachers in the state. When a bilingual program is mandated, then bilingual and ESL teachers are needed. But in a state where bilingual and ESL teacher shortages have existed historically, the mandate is problematic. So as you can see, establishing a transitional bilingual education program in Connecticut has limitations that originate in the law, and that and the availability of professionals that can provide these services. So this happens usually in transitional bilingual programs, which are the ones that are the most available for language learners. So in regards to the bilingual law and teacher shortages, the Connecticut law says, if the school district, quote, is not able to hire a sufficient number of certified bilingual education teachers, the Board of Education may apply to the Commissioner of Education for permission to use a certified teacher of English as a second language to fill its need, and the Commissioner may grant such request for good cause shown. In such a case, the school district will have to find other ways of providing instructional support in the student's native language. End quote. So notice that the law recognizes the challenge of finding teachers to supply programs for English learners. However, this might be one of the biggest issues with the design of bilingual education programs in our state. Many times, a program that was supposed to provide quality native language instruction does not provide native language instruction at all, which is counter to the purpose of a bilingual program. To address the need of professionals that can provide instruction in the native language to language learners, many schools hire tutors who are bilingual, but who may not have training in teaching. Quality bilingual education for English learners is not just the presence of the native language. It also entails teaching skills, and to acquire these, training is required. One last aspect in the Connecticut law is an important change that occurred in 2015, thanks to the efforts of advocates of English learners in the state. For transitional bilingual education programs, the time limit has historically been 30 months. That is to say, a student who receives transitional bilingual education, which is instruction in both native language and English, can only sustain this program for 30 months. Research states, however, that learning English for school success requires much more time than 30 months, and I have discussed this previously. Also, in previous classes, we have discussed that for English learners to reach academic parity with their English-speaking counterparts, it might take between 5 to 7 years. So this is not just a 3-year goal. It's much longer than that. As a result of staying in a TBE program for only 30 months, many English learners don't have enough time to reach the English proficiency levels needed so that they can efficiently participate in regular education. So the important change that occurred in 2015 to the Connecticut law in regards to English learners was the extension to 60 months for students in transitional bilingual education programs who might need the 30-month extension. However, the extension is not automatic. This means that the school must make the case for an English learner who, after 30 months in the TBE program, might need additional language supports before they can join a regular education classroom. The case must be made to the state, and data that supports the need for additional time in the TBE program must be provided. Let's go back to our objectives for the session. At this point, you should be able to remember and list the different programs and services offered to English learners in Connecticut. You should be able to identify and be able to describe, hopefully, the characteristics of the different programs. For example, you should be able to talk about who the students are in the different programs, who are the teachers, and what are the ultimate educational goals. And also, you should be able to recall some of the aspects that we discussed about the Connecticut law for program offering. And you should be able to recognize and talk about the limitations that the law, as it is currently, has for schools and students. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and I hope you do well on the quiz. I'll see you next time in class.